I should have shaved. Hey, Scott here, and shit's crazy right now. Like, we've got an infectious disease, we've got murder hornets, we have Tony Hawk 1 and 2 actually getting a good remaster. Yeah, they're actually keeping the original soundtrack, which, you'd think is obvious, but the most important part about all three of these things is that it means we need to stay inside and stay safe. But the ska-laced punk paradise of Tony Hawk isn't the only way that you can spend your time. Skillshare is a community led by incredibly talented people who want to help introduce you to a new hobby, or maybe even take one of the hobbies you already have and make it into something more. Video, photography, illustration, design, music, Skillshare offers thousands of classes on a variety of different subjects. There are tons of industry professionals who still use Skillshare, and at under just $10 a month, you can too. And the first 1,000 of our subscribers to click the link down in the description can get a free two-month premium membership so you can explore your creativity. Thank you to Skillshare, and now on to the Talkcast Podshow.
Hello and welcome to the Talkcast Podshow, the #1 show on the internet and the answer to all your rhetorical questions. I'm Lanny, and I'm joined this week by my metaphysical brother,
Kaiser. Hey everybody, how you doing?
There we go. I believe the show came out literally on 420. Mm-hmm. And I had not watched it before then because I didn't have any mind-altering substances because I'm a good little legal Boy Scout over here.
Good Christian boy.
Yeah, good Christian Texas boy. All we have is homegrown CBD. That's what we're allowed to have, and boy howdy, that's what we work with. But you told me that I would really, really like the Midnight Gospel.
I was hoping you'd really like the Midnight Gospel. Was I correct?
You were very correct. It made me second guess why we're in the podcast business right now when this exists and has already, done everything I would ever want to do with a podcast.
Fun fact, by the way, 420 is also Duncan Trussell, the man who plays Clancy's birthday.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which I think was the appropriate nature of a lot of the things that went on within this particular show, which, just to give a brief description of what it is, because the trailer does not quite do it justice.
Yeah, I feel like, I do feel like the trailer does not quite tell you what you're in store for and the very nature of the show itself.
Absolutely not. You look at the trailer and it looks kind of like Adventure Time by the way of Rick and Morty, which it kinda sorta, like visual motif wise, kinda sorta is. It's very much like a very adult themed Adventure Time-esque, like Adventure Time rules kind of world that this all kind of takes place in, where nothing has to make sense and you just got to be okay with that. Mm-hmm. But while it does have a semblance of an overarching plot throughout this first season that was dropped on Netflix, it is actually a podcast.
Yeah. So essentially, Pendleton Ward was a huge fan of this podcast from Duncan Trussell called the Duncan Trussell Family Hour, if I'm correct. I believe that was the name. And he was listening to it way back in the day, back in 2000, I think, 13? 12?
The Duncan Trussell Family Hour. He's also made a lot of appearances on Joe Rogan, the Joe Rogan Experience.
And was also...
Which I think is like the penultimate podcast right now.
Right. And was also in a couple episodes of Adventure Time. Duncan Trussell was, that is.
Yeah.
And so Pendleton Ward, a big fan of this podcast, after Adventure Time was over, he said, I'm not going to make any more TV shows. Pendleton Ward never made a podcast. He said, I don't want to make another TV series. How do you follow up on Adventure Time?
Yeah.
And then somehow, some way, he was like, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get a podcaster and turn episodes of his podcast into a show.
But they do it in such an interesting way, because they took a very specific subject matter for all of these episodes, all very tangentially related to spiritualism and death and perception.
Just a lot of philosophy in general, really.
Mm-hmm. But they kind of go in a certain order where, like, the first episode is more about the concept of perception and how drugs can modify or change how you view the world and see different things. Episode 2 focuses a bit more on spirituality in terms of life and death, specifically from a Christian perspective. Episode 3 is kind of... Episode 3 was a really odd one for a few reasons. I did a little bit of research on some of the people that he was talking to. Do you remember episode 3, the dude with the fishbowl head?
I remember that one very specifically because he keeps talking about magic. And I'm like, okay, what the fuck? Who the fuck is this guy? What is happening?
Is he for real? Because he was a Zen Buddhist, apparently, is what he discovered in prison. And the reason he was in prison was for murder. Yeah, he was one of a group called the West Memphis 3, which back in they were 3 teenagers back in 1994. They murdered. I can't remember specifically, but they murdered a guy and were all sentenced basically to 20 years to life in prison. And that was the guy he was interviewing in episode 3, and I guess. I have no idea. Like, I didn't do any research on the whole magic and the what was it, Golden Dawn or something that he kept referring to.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing it is the stuff they were talking about was like interesting and stuff that I had always like thought about in terms of like, you know, what happens after you fade on, because he talks about the first death and then the last death. Which the first death is when you pass beyond the mortal coil. The last death is when you have no sense of consciousness left, when you're just erased back to your factory settings, basically. And that concept has always intrigued me. Like, where does life truly end? Is it when you no longer have a sense of self, a sense of consciousness? Is it when you don't have a pulse? Or is there something beyond? To go into the existential nature of all this stuff, I'm curious, what do you believe happens when you die?
Oh, okay. So, I grew up kind of pseudo-Christian when I was a kid because I grew up in a family that talked about, oh, well, you know, when you're good, you go to heaven, and when you're bad, you go to hell, and there's Jesus Christ, who's the Son of God. And, you know, for a good portion of my adolescence, you know, my youth, I had no idea about anything beyond that. I didn't know about, you know, the actual dogma. I'd never read the Bible, and it was weird because when I was living in Colorado Springs, you know, I lived next to a very Christian family, and they were weird. And I thought they were weird. And then I actually went to a Christian school. And I learned all about everything. And I learned about heaven and hell and how to get to both. And nowadays, I'm more of what people call a soft atheist. Because I don't believe in any human religion. But I also don't believe that there's nothing after death. And that's what a soft atheist is.
So you're agnostic.
No, there's a difference, and people. Okay. It's a slight difference because the agnostic will tell you, I do not know if any of these are true. The soft atheist will say, I do not think any of these are true, but I also don't believe that there's no spirituality, nothing after death. Okay. A hard atheist will say, I don't believe any of these are true, and there is nothing after death. And that's it seems like such an arbitrary distinction between the agnostic and the soft atheist, but it's very important because the agnostic is truly, I don't know, and neither does anybody else.
Right. But, okay. So, to you, what do you believe happens after you pass beyond that coil?
Fuck me, man. I don't know. Because I think there's a part of me, and it's that part that I think is afraid of death. I think it's that part that's like, oh man, I can't, with my mortal brain, quite understand the concept of nothingness.
Well, of course, that's, I mean, there is no greater mystery in life than what is beyond it.
Yeah. And so when I think about it, there's just this part of me deep inside that's like, I'd like to think that there's something after we die. I'd like to think that there is. I hope that there is. And I remember my dad, when I was a Christian, back when I was literally a good Christian boy, my dad told me, like, I don't believe in any of that stuff. But I also think that there is something after death. I think there's something that encapsulates the entire world and connects all of us. I think there is an energy, and when we die, we return to that energy. And that always stuck with me. Mostly because, as far as I'm concerned, nobody actually knows what happens when we die. I don't think anybody actually knows what happens when we die, and that's why I think religion is just generally a coping mechanism.
It always has been.
Yeah.
It's been a way to explain life's mysteries in ways that can make people feel comfortable with them.
Well, and that's largely because when it comes to humanity, no matter what, through no matter what civilization pops up, the same question, the same two-part question will always appear, no matter what. And those questions are, where do we come from and where do we go? And there was
followed up very shortly to Pastor Cotton Eye Joe.
Yeah. Well, and I was just gonna say, and there's frankly no answer that is more terrifying to a good portion of any sentient being than we don't know.
Very true. I firmly believe that there is something after all of this, and it goes one of two ways. That I can firmly say that I believe there will be something after you pass on. Because either the spirit, the soul, whatever you want to call it, exists and it goes off and it, runs wild for a little while, goes through the great recycling machine of the entropy of the universe and then gets pushed back out through some other form, whether you believe in reincarnation, whether you believe that it'll just stay out there in the ether forever in heaven, or there's the other method, which is as you are dying, as you are losing the last bits of whatever brain power you have left, your body just produces all of these chemicals that to your brain will start to dilate time. And you will begin to dream the most visceral, realist dream you can possibly dream. And to you, it will last forever, because after that, there is nothing else. So, yeah. Because, that's basically how it is. That dream will go on forever, and that is essentially an afterlife. So, one way or another, I believe it exists.
All right.
So, yeah, I really like the Midnight Gospel, because this is the kind of shit I think of in my off time.
So, Midnight Gospel, I had seen a couple of images from it, and I saw it pop up on my queue on Netflix, like, hey, you should watch this. And when I saw that Pendleton Ward was involved, I was like, all right, fine, I'll give it a single episode to see if I'm into it. And I could not believe what I was watching while I was watching it, because the entire series, Pendleton Ward sat down and said, all right, I want to be able to make an animated show where you never have a single repeated frame. I want, when characters move, I want them to never repeat. I want them to, he eschews puppetry models. He just goes with traditional 2D animation. And it's obviously, it has to be very simple to do what he was trying to do, what they were trying to do. But
if you call some of that stuff simple.
Well, I mean, the character models are often very simplified.
Oh,
there's no there's very rarely any shading on the models. They're just a lot of very rudimentary shapes put together. But that simplicity also gives them this great emotional range. And the movement throughout all of it, the sheer amount of movement going on, not only in the foreground, but in the background. And in the background, you will always see this other story, this other significant story that you might at first, when you're watching it, believe is not actually related specifically to what they're talking about, but if you go back and you rewatch, you realize that everything that's going on in the background, everything that's being talked about is actually ties back into the subject matter of what's being talked about. And I found that
what you're seeing is like always in some way, shape, or form a visual metaphor for what they are talking about.
Yeah. And it was I just couldn't get over how gorgeous that first episode was. And I thought the conversation was interesting. I thought that was fascinating. And at the time, I had no idea exactly what the show was doing. I had no idea that Pendleton Ward had literally taken a podcast and made it into a 22-minute animated feature. And I was fascinated by it because I was like, okay, I guess Pendleton Ward just got this guy to sit down with another guy and talk. When no. And also, really interestingly, for a couple of lines, they got those people back in to record some...
some like little bits like, that girl just took my eye.
Yeah, I found that fascinating. I was like, oh wow, that's really cool that they were able to get some of those people to come back in and do... I forget what they're called. Not supplementaries, but incidentals.
Yeah. And
so that was so cool. And that first episode hooked me. I had to watch the rest of the series, even if nothing in the rest of that season was going to be quite as fascinating as the first one. Which, by the way, there are and more. Every single episode of this series, I think, is legitimately interesting and worth watching. And obviously, and I think like my favorite is the last one, and I don't want to spoil that. Like, there are a lot of people I know in our audience who have not watched The Midnight Gospel, and I don't want to spoil it.
The last one is something that specifically interested me, as in, okay, so the last episode and, which episode was it? The last two episodes.
Yeah.
Both focusing very heavily on the concept of the cycle of life and death. Those were my two favorite episodes, like far and away. I thought his interview with Caitlin Doty, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that. I'm sure you're listening in dutifully, Miss Doty. But I thought that interview about, because in that episode, she is, the manifestation of death, and it is literally an interview with death.
And death is adorable.
Oh, yeah. But it's, God, I just... that one is probably my favorite episode, and then the last one with his mother was the ending of it actually made me cry.
I cried twice.
There isn't really a plot to this show, but there is kind of like an overarching narrative going on about this character Clancy, which Duncan is playing throughout all this. Clancy is essentially an intergalactic podcaster called a spacecaster who's just going from simulated universe or simulated Earth to simulated Earth, interviewing different people to talk about things for his show.
Yeah, the overarching plot of the series is that there are these things called tech farmers, or simulation farmers, who use biocomputers to simulate universes to harvest technology from them. Basically, they create miniature universes, go within them, and then pull stuff out. It's fascinating. It's this really super duper cool
it's very Pendleton Ward tech.
Yeah, and he uses that, and he's like, okay, that's just the background of all this. He treats that as a vehicle. And that's so fascinating to me, because you could create a really fascinating series out of that concept alone. He just uses it for a vehicle to talk about philosophy and
it's kind of like the anti-Rick and Morty like that. In a lot of ways, where Rick and Morty kind of have like some philosophical and like spiritual shit going on in like the subtext. All of the adventures and stuff is the subtext, whereas everything else is like the main course. Mm-hmm. And that's what I found most fascinating about this show in particular. For those listening right now, I can't okay. It is definitely not for everybody. But I, as a person, cannot recommend it highly enough.
I have to agree with that sentiment exactly. I don't even know what I could say other than some of you guys are gonna find it boring and maybe even dumb. But if you can enjoy it, if you want to hear about philosophy, about self-help, about spiritualism through the lens of people who have spent their entire lives studying these things and living these things, and you also want to experience amazing, beautiful, trippy visuals, it's spectacular. Obviously some episodes are definitely stronger than others, and you're right. It's those last 2 episodes are probably the best in the entire first season. I say first season because I think it's going to get a second one. I hope it does. I personally, truly, really hope that it gets a second.
I think it'll take some time because from what I understand, it took years to make this season.
2 years apparently.
Okay.
Yeah. Which, by the way, the thing that really threw me off was finding out when that last podcast actually happened. Because some of these take place at different times. The episode 3 one with the magic guy that was like back in 2018.
Yeah.
That last one was back in like.
It was one of the earlier recordings, right?
Yeah. And when you find out about that, when you find out like
exactly when it was recorded, that adds that whole extra layer to it.
Yeah, especially when you find out that yeah.
That episode is a trip, especially knowing that.
Yeah, that sorry, again, I know that's really, really vague, you guys, but when you watch the episode, if you watch the episode, you'll understand why we're being vague, because there's a question that's asked, what do you do about that? And the answer to it broke me.
But it's such a beautiful episode. Like, I think the animation on that one, very much on purpose, went above and beyond.
Oh yeah.
What like some of the previous episodes had done.
Yeah.
It is fantastic as in terms of like in terms of psychological and philosophical conversation. It's basically High Talks the show. But I absolutely love that kind of stuff because that's where my brain goes a lot of the time, especially when I'm alone.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It does remind it. You know, you're not wrong about High Talks. It reminds me of my time in Lake Charles, Louisiana.
Yeah, I mean, like those are the kind of conversations I love having while in an altered state of mind where such intoxicants happen to be legal. Mm-hmm. It's such and the framing devices, like the first episode almost lost me for a second, like as it started, because like it took me a while to get into the whole podcast concept of it. But the visuals, the visual storytelling that's going on with it kind of pulls you along. Because the first episode, he's interviewing Drew Pinsky, Dr. fucking Drew.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And, like, he just kind of shows up on this Earth, which is being swarmed by a zombie apocalypse. And he wants to interview Glasses Man. And Glasses Man's like, I'm actually the president. Oh, okay. And they just continue, like, they start having this conversation about basically psychedelic drugs and whether or not drugs themselves can be considered good or bad. And I was like, I don't know if this is like something that's for me, because like the first episode doesn't get into that really heavy subject matter that I actually really enjoyed this show for, but the visual storytelling kept me going. There's this point in the episode where like they'll just start doing like the character models will just start doing, or the characters will just start doing random shit as they're talking. Like the president's playing a game of pool and it'll start like whacking the fucking cue across the table, just smacking the balls everywhere for no reason, just as a source of visual comedy as they're talking about I guess Clancy almost overdosing on Ambien or something like, or not Ambien, but some form of sleeping pill.
Yeah.
It might have been Ambien actually. But they're just completely going like they're just playing all this visual stuff in the background during these deep, heavy conversations. They kind of keep you invested when you kind of feel like tuning away.
Yeah.
What was your favorite episode in terms of like what animation was going on along with it?
Oh, that's actually really tough because part of me wants to say, was it episode 4? Damn it, I just had those damn episodes.
What was the character that was being interviewed? I can tell you.
It was the one with Pauly Shore.
Yeah, episode 4, Blinded by My End.
Yeah, that had some of my favorite visuals in the entirety of it. That fucking...
Trudy!
Hello, Trudy! God damn it, I fucking hated
Pauly
that.
Shore. Like, I hadn't heard him in probably a decade.
Yeah, and suddenly, like, when he showed up, I'm like, it can't be. And then it fucking was. And I'm like, what the fuck? Huh?
I'm like, when I was listening to it, I'm like, that's either Pauly Shore or Rob Schneider.
Yeah, and oh man,
it was Pauly Shore.
Yeah, that's probably one of my favorites. I mean, obviously, if it's not that one, it's the last one. Yeah, because the visuals in that one are just too good. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna change the answer because while I do love Blinded by My End, the amalgamation of religious symbolism and Turtles of the Eclipse, the second to last episode.
7th episode, with death.
Everything going on in the background, everything leading up, that was insane. Because there's so much being talked about, so much being referenced, so much playing off of each other. That one is... If you know about theology and philosophy, and you're watching that episode, it's like a whole theology course happening in the background. It's nuts. It's crazy.
I'm not. I was gonna say I'm not sure which episode was my favorite visually speaking, but the one that got me hooked visually speaking, like in terms of what it was going for, was the 2nd episode. The clown world.
Yes. Oh my god.
There's so much bizarre shit going on, especially when they're traveling through the tubes. The animation there, I'm just like, holy shit, that's really cool.
Yeah, and the fucking clowns, baby clowns. Oh no.
And the deer dogs, the noble deer dogs.
Oh. Yeah,
it's very Pendleton Ward, but. It's so fucking weird. Like, you'll be watching this show thinking like, oh wow, it's got some really weird, bizarre, cutesy animation. Then all of a sudden, a fucking a rat will pull a butt plug out of a fly's prolapsed anus, and you'll be like, huh?
Yep. Put a butt plug in your in the asshole of your soul.
Yeah, in the asshole of your mind.
Yeah, in the asshole of your mind. Yeah. The butt plug in the asshole of your mind. That is the subtitle for the Midnight Gospel.
And that quote actually comes from the only... I really feel like the only truly story-driven episode of the show.
Because,
episode 5.
That the actual interview segment of that is, like, no longer than 5 minutes.
Pretty much. I'm not sure if the interview just didn't go very long, or it's just like, okay, we need something to pad out this interview a little bit. Maybe we overestimated how much we actually had to talk about here, or maybe it was just something short and simple that they knew they wanted to add in, but they didn't have a whole lot for.
Well, so I've actually practiced a lot of meditation.
Well, yeah.
Part of that is because I deal with anxiety, and they're very accurate about. Everyone misinterprets, and I think this is because of our flawed perception of Eastern religions and Eastern spiritualism through our media, if I'm being completely honest. Everyone misinterprets meditation as clearing your mind. And it's not clearing your mind, it's accepting everything that's going on in your mind. It's accepting, and it's letting the river that is your mind flow without obstacle. It is calming yourself and taking everything in and letting go of the struggles of your mind and your body. And meditation is a process. No one ever achieves this level of complete, serenity, but it is to help you keep calm, focus, and process.
I think one of the... Oh, sorry. Continue.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I was just going to say, and as someone with anxiety, I had to learn that because it helps me deal when I get fucked up by shit.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the biggest issues there, in particular, is there's a difference between, like, because when people say clear your mind, that's not actually what they mean. And another thing the show kind of touches on when they do talk about meditation, they talk about it in the 3rd episode and they talk about it in the final episode. What they mean when they say clear your mind is achieving a true sense of presence in the moment, in the now, basically. Like, not living in the past, not looking into the future, just existing where you are. And the exercise that intrigued me the most in that discussion was when his mother was talking about, can you feel the inside of your palm? Yeah. Just focusing on something so specific. Like, feeling, not like, surface level, feeling the muscles in your hand, the meat around your bones. Can you feel that? Can you concentrate enough to feel that? And if you can do that, can you do it in each of your fingers at the same time? Can you do it in your arm at the same time? Can you do it in both arms? Can you do it in your legs? Can you do it in your whole body? If you can do that, that is what achieving a sense of true presence is. Just existing how you are right now. Because right now, you don't need to worry about something that happened like 20 minutes ago. You're existing as things are. You're existing knowing that what is happening right now is okay. You are alive. You are breathing. You can feel things, touch things. Existing in the presence is what they mean when they say, like, clear your mind. That is kind of the definition some would give to enlightenment. Just being able to be consciously present. One of the things that I've worked on pretty hard over the past years, you know me, I'm not great one-on-one with people, which is great for somebody who likes to host a podcast. But one thing I've been actively trying to work on, and this kind of goes back to the episode Blinded by My End, where they talked about how do you be truly present? How do you practice listening? Because sometimes you're in a conversation and you feel like, this happens to everybody, you feel like you're not so much being in this conversation so much as you're waiting for your turn to talk. Your turn.
Actually, that's a good point. That was something I learned when I was very young too. When I was in high school, it very quickly occurred to me that conversations I had with my friends, and this was something like I was a very lonely teenager, and I struggled knowing people and maintaining friendships. I was awkward and a little dumb, so I had to.
You were a teenager.
Yes. And I had to look internally a lot. And one of the things that I learned very early on that stuck with me is that a lot of people, when they take part in conversations, are looking to give input. They're not so much looking to get input. They're not so much looking forward to a conversation. They're looking to add to this conversation. Mm-hmm. And
so it's more along the lines of like, okay, I hear, I comprehend what you're saying. Here's what I have to say to that. Let me add to your brain the stuff that I have here, because this stuff, it's fucking killer shit, man. Somebody with, I think it was ADHD, was talking about the fact that a lot of folks who struggle when it comes to socializing, people with ADHD and autism, when they struggle to socialize, one of the ways that they'll respond and interact with people when talking about heavy subject matters is they will give personal anecdotes of things that they've gone through, even when that's not appropriate. And that's such a struggle. It's a struggle, and that's something that I've had to identify with as well. Of, man, I don't know what to say right now, so I'm just gonna pull from my own personal experiences. And that's not always the right thing to do.
And it's tough. It's really tough to realize when it's really sometimes better to listen, to hear that person, Yeah,
and oftentimes it is just generally better to listen, to let the person feel like they are being expressed, because it's called venting for a reason. They are letting things out. They don't want anything back in. They want to put things out there to get rid of it, to expel those feelings, to express them.
Sorry, I'm reminded, my husband can be very helpful at times. But my husband has always had a problem delineating between when I'm just bitching and when I'm actually asking for help.
I have that problem all the time, too.
He'll start giving me some input, and I'm like, sweetheart, no, shh.
No, not now. Just let me bitch about this. Just say, that sucks.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's hard to delineate sometimes when it's a that sucks sort of moment and a I can actually help you with this kind of moment.
And that's why whenever I have one of those moments, I try to be like, do you want feedback, or do you just need me to listen? And people think that asking that question is rude or like or breaks the, like, oh, you should know. No. 90% of the time, 95% of the time, when you say, do you want me to listen or do you want feedback, the other person will appreciate the question and give you an honest response. And the other 5% that don't, well, there's a whole thing that could go into that. Maybe they're just pissed at the moment, but most people will give you a good response to that question. And I highly, highly recommend people ask that question when you have a friend who's going off.
Yeah, when you got somebody that's just like not having a good time and just like really wants to, like, you got to ask them whether or not they just want to complain about it right now. If they're okay processing it on their own, because like you said, most of the time people will be honest about that. And I know you'll, whenever I come to you with something, because when I come to you with something, it's usually something that's really fucking bothering me. You will ask me that question typically.
Yeah.
But nah, man, I absolutely loved this show. Another thing that I loved about it was the lesson, which I'd always, kind of just assumed in myself, but hearing it spoken out loud made a lot of sense to me, which is always be honest to a dying person.
I loved that line. Oh man, because I never thought about that before, but yes, always be honest to a dying person, and the conversation that surrounded that was so good.
Because he was talking about the loss of his father. And how his father was like, in death throes, like going in and out of, I guess, cognizance. But at one moment, he had this moment of clarity. And his dad just looked at him and was like, what's happening? And he said, like, remembering, always be honest to a dying person. He told his dad that he was dying. And he's like, oh, okay, start taking this stuff down. And he just, like, the dad just gave him a whole bunch of lists of, like, things that he wanted done after he died to make sure that everything was set up so that he could go peacefully. Because that's kind of the best thing you can do for somebody in that state on their deathbed, is making sure that they are, comfortable with moving on. That's got to be one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of all, because, as we were discussing earlier, there is no greater mystery. Nobody has the 100% de facto answer as to what comes after, because nobody's ever been there and back. Like, not long period of time, anyway.
I mean, there was that one dude who was asking for change, but...
I mean, he's, 3 days? Nobody ever saw him again after that? I don't believe it. Well, maybe, though.
But yeah, no, philosophical discussion for me has always been, so I don't have a lot of background in philosophy, but I actually read up on more of it than I think the average person, just because I got on a real big kick on it way back in the day. Now, knowing more than the average person does not make me better or help me really truly understand anything better, but it does lead to fascinating conversations. It leads to neat mind, thought experiments, and I definitely recommend, if if anybody in the audience is really kind of into not even morals, not even morality, just better understanding oneself and the reasons that we act the way that we do, please check out a podcast called You Are Not So Smart.
Fuck you, yeah, I am.
Exactly. That name is so condescending, but it's meant to be. Because when people hear the comment, "You are not so smart," their initial reaction is actually pretty negative. And what does that say about you?
Fuck you!
Yeah, exactly. So, it is a great podcast all about psychology, physiology, the reason that we respond the way that we do. Because most people, and this is just a fact, this is not, and I'm not saying I know all of the, I'm a psychology major, and I know philosophy, and I know this and that, and I'm much more smarter than you are. No, I'm dumb as fuck. The program actually talks quite in depth about the fact that people generally don't understand why they behave the way that they do. They don't know or understand. They only have ideas. They only have these concepts that they've built or that media has instructed them. Like, a lot of people don't get why we get angry when we're challenged on things. How when we're presented evidence, we double down instead of actually agreeing
accepting and processing the evidence.
Yeah. So I would highly recommend a program called You Are Not So Smart. There are a million podcasts. They talk about all sorts of different fascinating things with specialists, and it's fascinating. I highly recommend it.
Stuff like this that like really, I don't know. I love being introspective. One thing that I've always kind of figured about philosophy, it's not a dead art. I would never necessarily recommend going into like a philosophy major in college unless you want to teach it or want to become a comedian, because that's what I think modern philosophy is. Most stand-up comedians can, like, at least the ones that I really like, tend to fall under like some sort of philosophical ground. Like Bo Burnham, I feel like has a bit of philosophy in him.
Oh, hell yeah. Oh, he absolutely, he is 100% all about human nature, why we behave the way that we do, how to respond to it, how to subvert it. That's the reason he ever succeeded. And part of that came down to his own mental, his own, oh god, he's neurodivergent?
Sure. But I think you're focusing more on the sociological side.
Well, but that's the thing though. It all ties in.
Yeah, I mean, technically philosophy is everything. Philosophy is simply the question why.
Mm-hmm. And he studied a lot of that stuff because of his own issues with understanding himself. He studied that. He studied people. And that's what led him to become the person that he is, to make the comedy that he does. Because he knows, or at least has strived to understand human behavior and the everything that comes with that.
Yeah. And that's why so much stand-up comedy kind of like derives out of philosophy, is just because it's when a stand-up comedian goes up on stage, a good stand-up comedian, they're typically giving their view of the world and how it works, and often that comes back to the ideological question of why is it like this? Yes, I know white people drive their car like that. Why?
Why do white people be like that sometimes?
They know they do, but why though? But this show, I was not ready for it to be what it was, but I'm very happy it was what it was.
Yeah.
The episode that spoke to me the most, by far, was Turtles of the Eclipse, the Caitlin Doherty death episode. And it wasn't even necessarily about death itself. It was very early on. It was this moment where he's going through that like room of mirrors and just facing off against all these emotions, and
Guilt. And the room of judgment.
That hit kind of like a personal chord with me.
Yeah.
I mean, and I actually kind of want to go back to Q in April, because I kind of lied when I said which was like the most intense experience I've had with you guys. The most intense experience I remember was at Acon up in Winnipeg. When my wife told me that she didn't want to be with me anymore. That was back in August. And I've been through a lot of guilt, a lot of deep, deep emotions since then. And processing those and living with those and just existing with those feelings, those feelings of failure, of anger, of betrayal, of sadness, and still being able to come through those and still feel that same love for that person, and knowing that even if you're not meant to be together, that they still care about you. Being able to come through that and trying to come out of that stronger is... I mean, I've lived a very blessed life. I've been very lucky. And to say that that's the hardest thing that I've ever gone through. And technically am still going through. And I don't think I would have been able to without one of the things that the show also talked about, a very good support group. That weekend would have been very, very different for me if you and Taka and Ant hadn't been there. You guys kept me sane. You guys helped me a lot. And if it weren't for you, my family, my friend Caitlin, all my friends just being there for me, this... Do you remember when we came back from that and the first episode of Unabridged we had to film?
Was that episode 2?
It was. It was the episode about
2.
me wanting to be a father. That was the hardest thing I've ever had to perform. Because before all this, like the year leading up to it, Erica and I were talking about potentially having kids. I'm like, oh man, I want to be a dad. Like that's something I legitimately want to do. And that episode was fucking hard.
I remember I sat down with you. I was like, do we need to change things? Do we need to maybe rewrite this?
No.
Yeah.
I liked it as was, and goddammit, I was gonna get it out there. But man, yeah, just dealing with those heavy, heavy feelings. There's a phrase out there that I never really truly like. Well, I don't dislike the phrase emotional intelligence. Being able to understand and comprehend why and how you are feeling something, and not letting it control you, but letting yourself exist in it, is hard. Especially with the more negative emotions. Because you sit there and you wonder to yourself, like, is this forever? Like, because I don't know. I mean, you deal with anxiety, and going through an anxiety attack, it stresses you the fuck out, to say the least.
Yeah.
Existing in those emotions and learning how to process them is such a... It's a difficult lesson because nobody can teach you. It's something you have to figure out. It's something you have to go through and come out the other side on.
It is remarkable, though, how less afraid you are of them when you find out that there are other people who understand what that feels like. I will be honest. There's when you know people who have experienced the same anxieties and sadnesses and loss that you have, it's really important. And it's the difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is, oh, I'm sorry you're stuck down in that hole. Empathy is, hey, I've been in this hole. We can get out.
You haven't dealt with a lot of death in your life, have you?
No, actually. Death is the closest thing, and this is going to sound so strange, the closest thing to death that I've had to deal with in my life was back when I lived in Lake Charles. There was this atheist. There was literally an atheist group, because down in Lake Charles...
So the first time you've had to deal with this has been since I've known you?
Yeah.
Wow.
And there was because I didn't know my grandma. When she died, I literally felt nothing. I didn't know her. So there was this one guy in the group who was a recovering drug addict. And he was a sweet, friendly guy. He was one of those guys who wanted to be everybody's friend. And after he had, he'd stopped going to the meetings. And then about a month later, we found out that he'd overdosed.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't know him very well, but we had been invited to the wake. And it was the first time I had ever looked at a body. And I remember just looking down at this body, at this face of a person that I had seen open and wide and talking to me. And and it's like everybody says, they look like they're sleeping, but you know that they're not. And it's just, I remember looking at that and saying, this is it. This is the inevitability. This is something that no matter who you are, this happens. And that was the first time I'd ever actually had to look at death. I'd ever had to face death. And that stuck with me only on the level of it really helped kind of put that more into the reality of the everyday that I live. But I've never lost somebody that I love. That has not been a thing that I've had to deal with. Closest thing was a cat when I was young.
Yeah, I've never lost anybody in my immediate family. I've lost an uncle, most of my grandparents, great-grandparents. Like, I knew a lot of my family growing up. And I was introduced to the concept of death at a very early age. When my uncle passed, or actually no, my great-grandmother, or great-grandfather was first, then great-grandmother, then uncle. Then some years later, some of my grandparents started going. And of course, a lot of pets on the way. It never gets any easier. That feeling, that sense of knowing that you've seen or spoken to that person or interacted with them for the last time. But as it goes on with all forms of loss, it gets easier because the sun always comes out the next day. And one day it'll be your last time to interact with anybody. Somehow, as a species, we all have to make peace with that in one way or another.
Yeah.
And I've been looking at the chat. Thank you all for the well wishes there. Eric and I are still on good terms. There's a lot of personal stuff that went on with it that I won't get into, but long story made significantly shorter. The designs that we each had on our lives did not mesh. She's a very private person. I am a very, very public person. But no, we're still on very good terms. She's still a very good friend of mine, and I still love her.
Yeah, and she's friends with a lot of us, and
yeah,
things they were not messy. They were just the reality.
It was a very matter of fact kind of thing, and it's still obviously shitty to deal with, but being processed as we move forward. Yeah, that's life, man. It's just a big bundled mess, and learning how to feel what we feel and how to process all those feelings. Like that's what you do every day. And that is what I loved about this show. It puts a lot of things in perspective, things that you don't really think about. I think it's very appropriately named.
The Midnight Gospel?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's sort of tangentially related, but this was sort of an interesting thing a friend of mine had brought up. And he's not the person who said this, but he brought up a quote about what's been happening lately.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking about being in the present, right?
Yeah.
With what's happening right now, with everybody inside and dealing with all of these problems, there was this therapist that talked about right now we are living in an infinite present because future plans have all been put on hold. We're all stuck in the same place. We don't know what the future is going to be, so a lot of us are just kind of dealing with almost this frozen time, like 2020 stopped. Like everything just stopped. And it has been so tough to deal with that for some people because we're used to, I've got these plans and I'm going to work on these plans and I'm going to make them happen. And now we're being forced to stop moving, stop doing, stop acting, stop planning for a lot of people. Some other people have been dealing with it better. Some people have been like, well, I can continue to do my job and I can continue to create, and that's great. But not for a lot of people. For a lot of people, we don't know what's happening. We don't know what we're doing. We don't know what the future is going to be like in the next couple of months because we thought we knew what our 2020 was going to be. Shitty, but manageable. And now,
normal life.
Yeah, my normal fucking life. But yeah, now it's like, hey, I sent a card to my mother-in-law. It was this very heartfelt letter to my mother-in-law because my mother-in-law is the sweetest woman. She's wonderful, and I love her. And she was like, oh my God, thank you for this card. That meant a lot. And we had this really nice conversation. And the conversation ended with, I can't wait to see you for Christmas. And then I was like, yeah, I can't wait to see you either. And then I walked over to Christopher and I'm like, Christopher, I hadn't thought about this, but what the fuck are we going to do about Christmas?
Yeah.
What the fuck are we going to do? Like, I don't know if we're going to be able to go see your family, and we do it every other year. Like, we used to switch out between my dad and my mother-in-law, and it's like, oh my God, I don't know if we'll be able to see them. I don't know if we'll be able to actually go see family. And it's such a small thing, oh yeah, we get to see them every other year, but maybe not this year. And if things go really badly, maybe not next year.
Well, I'll still be hosting TFS Thanksgiving at my place, and if shit truly hits the fan and just like nothing is moving, I could probably run Christmas as well.
Hell yeah, Christmas at Lanny's place.
Hell yeah, I got the space.
You do?
I can set up and I know how to cook a goddamn meal.
I do you? Do you cook?
I do cook. And I actually kind of want to end this on like a lighter note. You were mentioning how we're kind of like trapped in this presence, this eternal, infinite present.
Yeah.
I don't like to think of it. Well, I mean, that's a fun phrase. I like that, the infinite presence. But I kind of like thinking of this time for those that are stuck at home, even those who can't do work right now. I like to think of this time as a chrysalis of sorts. A time where everybody out there is in this cocoon. And this is your chance to really focus down on some of those things that you've always wanted to improve on. Maybe if you got furloughed or laid off, this is a time to start building up one of those skills for either improving your odds of getting another job in a similar field to what you were doing, or building up a skill in order to do something else entirely when you get out. There are still a bunch of online schools out there. In fact, I'm pretty sure this episode is sponsored by Skillshare.
I think it is, actually.
I'm pretty damn positive. And if it wasn't, I'm pretty sure it is now. Link in the description for the YouTube audience. This wasn't an intentional shill. I promise. I'm really good at my intentional shilling. My unintentional shilling is God tier.
You actual garbage person.
But taking that time to actually build on yourself, I like using the phrase bubble. Better you, better life. It is kind of like my personal philosophy of how I like to move forward. Improving on those things for yourself to make you feel better as a person, to test new things, do whatever it is you feel that you got to make your life better. While a lot of the world out there is just sitting and waiting. Because once this curtain drops, once all of this can finally go back to whatever we're going to call the new normal, you'll be ready. That's what I got to say about that.
I made a video about how much I love B-stars. That was my accomplishment.
What have you done lately? Let us know in the comments. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. We will catch you next time, probably on a less heavy topic. In fact, I think we'll be talking about Scoob next episode.
Oh my god, is that coming out?
The existentialism of Scoob.
Hold on. Is that coming out on Friday? Yes, it is.
Okay, this Friday.
Next week, we'll be talking about Scoob.
Yeah, man. Ruby. Ruby.